Well, thank you for the invitation, and for thinking I have something worth saying about this. I'm not an expert on China. I may be a professor, but my field is philosophy. But all my life, I've been looking at China from a distance, and most of us on the left feel that, we have to understand China. So I'm just going to go through quickly the various stages I've gone through about that, and then my recent intense study and experience of China. So I'm going to use PowerPoint. So I'm briefly just going to describe my process of thinking through China, and then come to the questions that you've posed about China. So, for many years, Red China, as it used to be called, all the time, was in the distance. I grew up in the 1950s, and it was this specter of this mysterious yet menacing presence. And we didn't really know what to make of it, but it was the enemy, and we were taught to fear it. Then in the 1960s and 1970s, I moved to the left. I was very new left at the time. And we were quite fascinated with the Cultural Revolution. We imagined ourselves as the Red Guards of our own society at that time, and this idea of questioning everything, and not being satisfied with the world as it was given to us, but feeling we had to call everything into question and challenge it. And then when we saw they were burning books and all of this, it began to get a bit more disturbing, especially those of us that were aspiring intellectuals and someday wanted to write books. But we really didn't know what to make of it. I mean, most of us didn't know anybody who was Chinese, anybody who'd ever been to China. And the sources of information were scant, and hostile. I learned because I could see how the mainstream media treated our movement. I didn't trust them for how they were dealing with this movement. But it was very hard to find alternative sources. Um, so for many years, I watched and I wondered, from the 1980s on, through the 90s and the 2000s. There were questions about capitalism versus socialism. Was China socialist anymore? Was it even trying to be socialist anymore? And just constantly watching the news, looking for alternative sources, and trying to put a narrative together for myself about China. Because I always felt that it was important, it loomed large in my sense of geopolitics. And I felt coming into the 2020s that it was time that I engaged in a really intensive investigation, and this coincided with my opportunity to have a direct experience of China because I was invited to come and teach there. So I'm just going to go through a brief periodization of the People's Republic of China. I'm sure this is very familiar to you, but I've had to review this for myself, so I'm just going to go through it quickly. I'm putting it in terms of three periods. From 1949 to 1976, the revolutionary period, symbolized, led by Mao Zedong, but I don't believe in the great man theory of history, so there were many people and masses in motion, actually, not just many people in motion. It was a revolution. It was a period of state formation, radical land reform, all kinds of experiments, successful and unsuccessful. We hear more about the Great Leap Forward, which was a bit of a disaster, as opposed to more successful ones like the collectivization of agriculture, the anti-landlord movement, and all of this. And in these early days, China was anxious not to be alone in the world and to find allies. And of course, its primary ally in its early days was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union came in with all kinds of expertise. and helped China in the early days, all kinds, especially very practical skills like scientists and engineers and agronomists and all of this. And they were, really quite useful in the early days. And it also meant that China structured itself after the Soviet model, because there weren't that many alternative models at the time. I mean, there were other socialist countries that were coming on the scene at the same time as China, but the Soviet Union was the only one that had been there and had any kind of experience of trying to build socialism in a hostile world. It must never be forgotten. And so, there was all the Sino-Soviet split. I think was a great tragedy in the socialist movement, and I don't think China. It took a long time for China to recover from that. And there was the Cultural Revolution, which is very familiar to all of you, I'm sure. And so the question I raise about this period, I raise it to myself: was this a period of socialist acceleration, or was it ultra-left chaos? And my own conclusion to that is that it was both. Um, in 1976 to 2012, the reform period, the leadership at the time was Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao. And this period was called Reform and Opening Up. It involved the decollectivization of agriculture. It involved bringing in capitalist enterprises, both foreign enterprises and new indigenous Chinese businesses, as well as the privatization of some already existing state-owned enterprises. There's still state-owned enterprises, which are a very powerful part of the economy, but some of these state enterprises that were existing at this time became privatized in a rather dubious way. Some of the people who were managers of state-owned enterprises, basically ran them down and assets stripped and formed alternative businesses. Um, and so, it's a very problematic period. And it was also a period of privatization of public services, but at the same time, monumental modernization and absolutely massive poverty eradication. So the question about this period was, did China embark on a capitalist road, or was this an alternative path to socialism? I think this is a very hard question. I think that it went very far along a capitalist road, but it left open a path to socialism, as I see it now. So in 2012 to now is a period that I'm calling a rebalancing period. They don't call it that. They call it the new era under Xi Jinping. I think, as I understand this period, it's a period of restructuring of the relationship of the capitalist versus the socialist elements um, of the economy and the society, for that matter, because they did go very far along a capitalist road, and they're bringing in all kinds. They have been bringing in since 2012 more and more regulation of capital, a very, very strong anti-corruption drive, and also a revival of Marxism. And so, the question about this period is it state capitalism or primary stage of socialism? Um, I believe that it's a primary stage of socialism, but in a very problematic kind of a way. I've been to many, many seminars and read articles and everything. There's a tendency for a lot of the discourse to say the same thing over and over, but not really deal with the difficult issues sometimes. And a lot of it, there's a lot of talk about, modernization, but without dealing with the whole tension between the capitalist versus the socialist elements of their whole modernization drive. So this is a, rough and ready historiography of the PRC. There are many controversial issues and debates about this, as well as silences about it. The most controversial issues are the legacy of Mao Zedong and the whole evaluation of the Cultural Revolution. The official position tends to be quite negative about the Cultural Revolution, and I feel that it leaves a lot of the story untold. The success of the collectivization of agriculture, the building of infrastructure that did occur during this revolutionary period. And the questioning, the very deep questioning, in terms of cultural and intellectual life. And so there's also very controversial the legacy of Deng Xiaoping. The same people who would have a positive evaluation of the legacy of Mao would tend to have a more negative evaluation of the legacy of Deng. And this goes, of course, with the evaluation of the reform and opening up and the account of Tiananmen Square in 1989. That is a big silence, Tiananmen Square in 1989. It's a discussion of that is very fraught, and I think that it's wrong to be silent about it, but because there is a debate about what, first of all, factually what did happen, and then what was the meaning of it. I believe myself that after looking into it and thinking further about it, I still end up believing what I believed in 1989, where I was very involved in looking at Eastern Europe and what was happening on the streets there. And I believe that roughly the same thing was happening in China. There were a whole spectrum of positions, from people who wanted a more democratic form of socialism than people that wanted to, just go all the way with the capitalist road. And I believe this was true in Tiananmen Square. Um, and then in coming to the later period, the whole role of the Chongqing experiment and Bo Xilai and the whole neo-Maoist revival early in this millennium. And, basically, questions about is it a capitalist road or a long, protracted road to socialism? That really is what's involved. So the question is China a capitalist or socialist? They claim nothing more than to be at a primary stage of socialism and to be involved in a very protracted process of building socialism. It's very hard to get them to talk straight about the relationship between capitalism and socialism. I keep asking the question, what is the relationship between capitalism and socialism in China? And one of the clearest things anybody said to me was, we have this strategy of using capitalism to build socialism, which is one of the most lucid, definite things that was said. Although it is what a lot of them believe. And, I think it's something that needs to be explored, um, because it's there. Um, but, the argument is that, the commanding heights of production, investment, and infrastructure are still in the hands of the state. The state is in the hands of the Communist Party. The land is collectively owned, to the accusation that it's undemocratic and authoritarian. They argue that they have what they call full process democracy, which I think is pretty interesting. I mean, you look at, there's been this tendency to think, not by you, I'm sure, but by, a lot of the people we talk to, that unless we have elections exactly like American or Western European elections, that it's not democracy. And the idea that somebody can just, be a star in an entrepreneurial reality TV show and become president is like to a Chinese person unthinkable because to reach the top leadership layer in China or a lot of the intermediate levels of leadership, you have to start at the very bottom. You have to start at village level. You have to serve your time in poor, remote, rural villages and even work with your hands, even today, to rise to the top leadership in China. And you have to and there are elections and evaluations of you at every stage along the way. Um, And there are lots of democratic procedures, including this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 line where any citizen can just, phone up and make a complaint, and they're guaranteed that the state will deal with it. Things like this. It's a thing I want to study a bit more to see how does it actually work. But that's the argument, and they argue that they're on a development path to a more advanced form of socialism. So teaching in China, I found this really, quite interesting because, for years I've been, teaching in universities in various parts of the world, in the US and Africa, and of course here in Ireland. So most of my teaching has been in the School of Marxism at Peking University. Some of it at the School of Marxism at Renmin University. I'm going back in this coming year to teach in the summer, this very intensive summer school at Renmin University, and then in the autumn again for the third time at Peking University. So, I've been trying to look at, the role that universities have played in this whole history of the PRC. And, there have been very drastic changes in universities in different periods in the history of the state. And Peking University, where I've been doing most of my teaching, has been to the forefront of a lot of the political developments in China during all these years. In fact, like it was at the forefront of the New Culture movement in the 1920s and was very involved in the foundation of the Communist Party, the May 4th movement, and the revolution itself, and then the Cultural Revolution in Tiananmen Square, and everything that's happened. Peking University has been involved in it. And also, I was quite interested to see, how are universities not only different in different periods of China, but different from, universities in this part of the world. And one of the things that's very different is the whole role of the party and the state in universities. And it's not necessarily true in all academic departments, but in the department where I was teaching, virtually all members, all the professors there were members of the Communist Party, and most of the students were either, if they were over 21, postgraduates, they were members of the party, and the undergraduates tended to be in the process of applying. It takes a couple of years to join the party and they were active in the Communist Youth League. Um, and this, these are different than the students that I would teach at DCU, which who tended not to have much in the way of definite political commitment. And also, I felt they had they felt a kind of responsibility for the world that I found interesting and not typical of current students. There are also the questions of parameters, what can be said and what can't be said. And, I'm the type that, okay, I want to kind of make good judgments about, what the norms are and what can and can't be said. But to me, those kind of boundaries are there to be pushed at and to be probed, which is what I did. And there are also questions now about the role of Marxism in teaching and research in Chinese universities, because the reform and opening up not only opened up the economy to to foreign and domestic capitalism, it also opened up the universities. It opened up intellectual and cultural life to capitalism. And it bears its marks. They're now under Xi Jinping. There's been a lot of investment in these schools of Marxism, and they're very big. And there are a lot of people involved in them, and they're in all the universities and all the third level institutions. Um, but sometimes I feel that there are these silos, and like, where is Marxism in the universities outside of the schools of Marxism? Because there are people who take approaches to various academic disciplines. They've basically been enamored of Western universities and accepted the global orthodoxies. They've been particularly enamored of the US and US universities, and that influence is still very strong. And the influence of Marxism is very weak in certain disciplines, particularly economics. Um, so, and they tend to just kind of, each do their own thing and not really engage in debate about this. Um, So also when I was there, I participated in a number of conferences and television programs in China. Last autumn, I was at the World Congress of Marxism, which was mainly Chinese participants, about 200 Chinese professors, and then about 50 foreign professors, all people that were, intellectuals. The World Socialist Forum, a few weeks later, was in some ways similar, but also different in that most of the people at that were from international communist parties. With an assortment, either, well, some of them were Chinese, but the foreigners there were, tended to be general secretaries or something like that in communist parties, and with a few kind of internationally known intellectuals. So it was interesting to observe the difference between those two and, the kind of speeches that were given, the kind of tone and not only what was said, but what wasn't said that always interests me as well. And also I was on a few television things. Some were just kind of doorstepping me at conferences. So just said a few things that were edited into the news. But the longest engagement I had was in the studio discussion, Voice of China, and it was about the relationship of Chinese universities to Western thought, really. And that was a pretty interesting discussion. So sightseeing in China, I didn't get outside of Beijing, but there's a lot to see and do in Beijing. I went to the Forbidden City, which I found kind of shocking in a way. I mean, it was the home of the whole. First of all, it's the whole city. I was much bigger than I thought it was. It was the home of the emperors for centuries. And the populace, except those who were directly serving the emperors, were forbidden to enter it. So now everybody can, enter it. The people that were forbidden could go into it. What really struck me, you see this picture down at the bottom of the slide. There are hundreds of people there that were dressed as as emperors and empresses and courtesans. And I first, when I'm walking in, I was with a couple of students, and I said, "What's going on here? Is there some kind of cultural performance or what?" No, no, people do this every day. The ordinary people come and they dress as emperors and empresses and aristocrats, and they all have their cell phones, and they take pictures of each other being emperors in the Forbidden City. I found this very disturbing, although, and I raised it in my class as well, because there is a kind of royal survival as well. There's a lot of, there's an awful lot of television drama about, the dynasties of the past and the romances of emperors and all of this, that I find a bit disturbing, although some of it shows the dark side of it, which is a bit better. But the fact that ordinary people would imagine themselves as emperors and empresses instead of the people who served them, or if they didn't serve them, they were locked out of the Forbidden City. So anyway, I had a good discussion with class about that. Um, and other places, the hutongs, this picture in the middle here, the kind of older housing, you get a sense of how people lived before all this supercharged modernization. And they're real neighborhoods, not Potemkin villages. They're places where people really live. And also one of the more interesting places is the CPC Museum. It's absolutely monumental. And a lot, it's not just, I used to hate museums when I was a child. I used to not like, just looking in at documents and looking in these glass cases at artifacts. But there's been a lot of creativity in museums in recent decades, and a lot of reconstruction. And there's a whole reconstruction of the Long March that makes you actually visually feel what it would be like to be to somebody on the Long March. I actually felt cold when I was in the middle of it. Reading China. The best books to read to get an overview of China are the two that I have there at the top, and they're different from each other. They're both books by Marx. Can you actually, on my screen, I can't actually see the one on the right because I'm seeing all the people, but maybe your view it's different. But anyway, the one book, The East is Still Red by Carlos, they're both British-based authors, Carlos Martinez. It's basically the party line, the CPC party line about China, but kind of ably explained. The other one is not. It's a Verso book written by Lin Chun called Revolution and Counter-Revolution in China, which is, I'd say, I would call it neo-Maoist, and very, very critical of the reform and opening up and everything that's happened since then, and considering it to be counter-revolution. Also, other books I'd recommend. This one by Xu Jun about the decollectivization of agriculture. He's somebody that I got to know. He's very interesting because, he grew up during the reform and opening up from, a rural village, but he was taught in high school, and then he went to Peking University. And he assumed that the collectivization of agriculture was a disaster and the decollectivization was necessary. And then he started talking to people in his village that had gone through the collectivization and decollectivization. He went to do a PhD in the US. And he just completely changed his mind about, the decollectivization of agriculture. He wrote a very strong book against the decollectivization of agriculture. This other book by Dong Ping is the other side of the culture of the unknown culture revolution. He bases it on his own county in Shandong province. And he said that during the period of the Cultural Revolution, that there was a great increase in agricultural productivity and rural education. And then after the end of the reform, after the end of the Cultural Revolution during the reform, there was a decline. He shows all of this statistically and, with a lot of research on the ground. The next book I have there, The Rise of China and the Demise of the Capitalist World by Li Mingqi. He argues that, that the rise of China is creating a lot of problems for global capitalism. And it reminded me of something that I saw in a speech by Marco Rubio in the last year, where Marco Rubio said that we thought that capitalism would change China, but what we found is that China has changed capitalism. I think this is a really interesting line of thought to think about China and the whole global scenario that's unfolding before us. And then another source I would highly recommend is Monthly Review. Monthly Review books. Those three books down at the bottom are Monthly Review press books. And then Monthly Review itself carries a lot of pretty high quality writing about China. So when you look on Amazon for books, you'll find the first ones that come up in a search, the most prominent ones are pretty hostile to China. I put on a collage there about a sample of the kind of books that would, come up in a search. It's interesting. One of the pages that I follow on Facebook is called China Books Review, which is a very unofficial. They review a lot of books about and written in China, and not at all party line. But in summing up the books, a lot of the titles of the year, I think it was the previous year, it said, well, each of these titles is distinct in breadth and quality. They all have one thing in common. They're really about America. In them, China, its agents, and its sympathizers are presented as the cause of a myriad of social ills, addiction, violence, poverty, and disease that plague American society.
Yeah,
So,
I'm just
and
Helena,
following up,
I'm just
what?
conscious of I'm just conscious of time that
Okay.
we're
Okay, I'll skip this. These
yeah.
are other books that I recommend. I'm going to skip them. The top layer are the ones that are anyway, I'll skip that. So I was going to say more about this, but I won't. But I want to say I've spent a lot of time looking at Chinese te film and television drama. And there's a lot more of it available than you would imagine. And I find it's a really good way to learn about China in a way that you wouldn't do with factual books or lectures. I've discovered just an awful lot about the texture of everyday life and the way people think and talk to each other and old customs, in the midst of this vast modernity. I've discovered many things, and I would have said more about it, but I won't. I'm coming to the questions that you posed here about probing the global role of China. And you asked, does China offer an alternative for the peoples of the world in terms of economic development and global governance? And then you ask, could there be a peaceful transition to a new order, or are we headed to global war as U.S. imperialism seeks to preserve the status quo? And I want to raise the question of what role does China want to play? What role is China playing on the global stage? What role does China want to play on the global stage? China does not want to replace the USA as the world's policeman. Through its entire history, in every period of its development, China has been critical of the US as the world's policeman. However, China has wanted to rise on the global stage. China does want to be a great power in the world. But its argument is that it's pressing for multipolarity. Uh, and I believe them in that. It wants to lead it in a certain way, but not totally dominate it. Um, it's involved in many initiatives, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Governance Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, which I think we should all study. It also takes the role of the UN, especially the role that the UN should play, as opposed to the role that it does play. The US has systematically sidelined and weakened the UN, disempowered the UN, never more so than under the Trump administrations, but nearly every previous administration has done that as well. Um, so I think that these initiatives are important to take seriously, but this whole idea that China is a threat, why is it a threat? It does not want to start a war against anybody, and it hasn't started a war against anybody since the late 70s. And I wouldn't defend the war that it fought in the late 70s against Vietnam. Um, but I think China is a force for peace and stability in a very, very turbulent world. I think that it's trying to play a very constructive role. I think that China does offer an alternative. The multipolarity. It's not any kind of socialist utopia. It's not even multipolarity. Isn't socialism. And most of us want socialism, but it creates the space of the possibility of socialism. And I think that we need to fight for this kind of multipolarity. There's this whole global restructuring of the world that's been going on, and Ireland has nearly had its heads in the sand about it. RT almost totally ignores it. Our government almost totally ignores it. Although I have the picture at the bottom is the recent trip of Michal Martin to China, which I think was a good thing. Um, but can there be a peaceful transition to a new order, or are we headed for global war? I don't know the answer to that. I think we are living in a very, very, very dangerous time. I would have said this even under the Biden administration. But under the Trump administration, it's just become so blatant, so absolutely reckless. The trade wars, the piracy, the kidnapping, the threats, the demand, the accelerating militarization, whole role the EU is playing, and Ireland is very weak in its response to this. It's pushing all of us to go along with this European intensified militarization, and I think we on the left have to take a very strong position in opposing this. But why is China a threat? It's not a threat. I mean, it's simply to the US, it's a threat because it sees it as a competitor. China doesn't see itself as a competitor. China wants to, to have the supercharged modernization. It wants to be admired. It wants to be powerful in the world. But it does not want to threaten anybody else, including the US. Um, and it's the U.S. insisting that it must be supreme. It must exercise this hegemony over the rest of the world. The President of the United States is a leader of the free world, as if there ever was this free world. So, just to find a word about traveling to China, China does encourage people-to-people, peer-to-peer contact. I think maybe, you should think about going. They're 30 days now visa free from Ireland. Ireland's on the list of countries that have more favorable treatment, not the US and the UK. And they're now direct flights from Dublin, and it's never been, as plausible to go. And I'd encourage you to think about that. So my conclusions for now. Um, I would argue that China has achieved what's perhaps the most spectacular modernization in the history of the world in time span and scale, accomplishing and surpassing in decades what took centuries elsewhere. Despite some mishaps, misfortunes, and even tragedies, it's developed productive forces in agriculture, industry, technology, science, and culture. It has raised millions from extreme poverty to prosperity, modest prosperity. It is not true, which many people think, that China was socialist and poor and then capitalist and rich. This is not true. Everything that it's achieved, all that it's achieved in terms of modernization and infrastructure was achieved built on the basis of what was built in the revolutionary period. It's moved seriously against crime and corruption. It's integrated into the global system, both for better and for worse. It manufactures much of what the world consumes. It leads the world now in green energy. By the way, I mean, for a while, it was kind of, modernization, development at all costs and being fairly careless about environmental damage. But it has converted to the ecological agenda. And when China does something, when it decides to do something, it does it in a big way. And it leads the world now in green energy and other ecological initiatives and other scientific and technical advances necessary for global survival. It engages in complex and credible cultural production. It's a force for peace in a dangerous world where the drums of war are beating more powerlessly than ever. And it's a world historical experiment in a new relation between capitalism and socialism, where there is a path open to a more radical form of socialism. So they're my conclusions for the moment.
So, what I want to say very quickly is this is not a debate between ourselves and Helena. And actually, I agree with a lot of what she says. And the most important thing is that these things are under question, right? Can the immense advances of China lead to the development of socialism? It's hard to answer that question just off the top of your head, so I'm not even going to attempt it. What I am going to say is this, the context. In 1914, Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, and historians mark that as the start of the First World War. But serious historians say, no, it's nonsense. It was breaking out everywhere. And if you take that position, we are in the Third World War. It's breaking out everywhere. The two things about it is the sheer savagery of the American hegemony, the capitulation of the subordinate powers, and thirdly, and the thing we can do something about, is the supine collapse of the left. And what I want to do in this week's speech is get tore in to the main public discourse which is called the discourse of inter-imperialism. It goes like, well, the US is imperialist, but then so is Russia, so is China, probably so is Iran. So that doesn't, we don't have to take any of these things into account. If everybody's imperialist, nobody is. So what we do is we turn around towards moralism. And we say them Chinese are dangerous, or we say them Ayatollahs are very unpleasant to women, and that's the deciding factor. And what I see is I see the multipolarity position as, if you like, the existing counterposition to this many imperialisms. Let's go along with our own one sort of attitude among the reformist left. And what I would feel is it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient because I would agree, and I think we should all agree, multipolarity would be a good thing. Multipolarity would be better than the hegemonic moment when the US rules everything. It would leave more space for the working class. But would it lead to socialism? And I think at the moment, China fails that test, and where it fails that test is in the test of Gaza. Because, you know, a lot of people were critical of Chinese response to Gaza genocide. And supporters of China replied and says, well, Chinese policy is to go along with the overarching political dynamic of the area. And the Arab regimes were supine, so they didn't feel they had the authority to intervene. And I think that's the weakness of their position, in that they both they and Russia have relations with states. And so that's very distinct from Maoism. Maoism had relations with people and were counter to the authorities in the states where they were operating. So where does that leave us? It leaves us that we're the collapsed reformist socialists who are supporting ongoing war with Russia, happy enough to gear up towards China, licking their lips at the thought of slaughter in Iran. They're just out of the picture. They've retired. The people who think that there's a multipolarity that we can take advantage of, I think are correct. But there's one task, and that one task is to have a communist party on our own soil and to identify the basis, the facts, where you stand. So you can stand in one place internationally, and the place you should stand is the threat to the world is the US hegemony. That's the threat. That's what could lead to nuclear war. That's what tries to eat away at every country in the world at the moment. And number two, the thing that we have to do is attack the manifestation of that in our own country. And there's two manifestations in Ireland. One is Mayhole and absolute capitulation to the war drive. And if there's a war in Europe, Ireland will be in it. There's no doubt about that. And number two, the north of Ireland's still a colony. So right now, it's got a major factory in Belfast that's building missiles that will be used in Ukraine. And I hope I'm far enough away from the factory, but I'm not absolutely certain about it. I think that's where we go. We sort of, we're in we're in trouble. We're in very serious trouble because there isn't really a serious mass working class movement anywhere that you can see. The working class in the West have been dispersed and replaced by people like Starmer and so on. And the way in which to get a movement is to answer a couple of major questions. And the two major questions I've outlined, we have to say, what's the danger on a global scale? And then we have to say, how can we deal with it both internationally and nationally. And I'll sort of send out notices later on. I think we really need to take this seriously, and we need to have drag in as many people as we can to discuss this further.